All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning for those who are joining us from Jakarta and Japan, and good afternoon for those of you who are joining from Australia. My name is Aristio Darmawan. I'm a lecturer in international law at Universitas Indonesia and also a research team here at the Indonesian's National Institute of Aerospace, Aeronautic and Space. It gives me a great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you here in this webinar today on the Enhancing Indonesia's Space Diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, an international perspective. As we all knew that in the last decade, space has been very important for many countries, and there has been an important development in the last decade, such as the increasing role of private sectors and non-governmental entities to engage more in the space activities. And it creates an opportunities for space economy as well as security concern, because the nature of space activities is involving a high cost, high risk, and high technology. Therefore, cooperations among states is very important. In the last decade also, there was an increasing importance of the Indo-Pacific regions. A geopolitical concept that connects the Indian Oceans and the Pacific Oceans has become a main theater for a global geopolitical arena. Even though the Indo-Pacific is very much a maritime-driven concept, it's very much important for us to see the role of space diplomacy in the regions. What are the challenges and opportunities that we can have going forward? Today, we are honored to have the two distinguished scholars and to talk about the space diplomacy issues in the Indo-Pacific. But before we go to the presentation sessions, let me invite Dr. Heru Triharyanto, the Director of Center for Aerospace Policy Studies at the Indonesian National Institute of Aeronautics and Space, to give his welcome remarks. Dr. Heru, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Mas Tio, and good morning for everybody who are in Jakarta, and of course, good afternoon for Professor Freeland in Australia and Professor Suzuki in Japan. And I aware there are some colleagues also attending from the US and from a few other countries. So welcome everyone. So this morning, we will have the first day of the webinar series regarding the space diplomacy in Indo-Pacific. And we are very honored that today we have two distinguished speakers, Professor Stephen Freeland and Professor Kazuto Suzuki, that will enlighten us and giving us perspective, international perspective on the matter. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you all, the participants and the speakers of today, and hopefully we could learn a lot from you, sir, and for the advancement of space activities in the regions. Thank you very much, Mas Dios. Come back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heru, for the very brief welcome remarks. Now, I would like to invite Ibu Yunita Permatasari, the lead researcher for this project, to give us a sense of presentations about to what extent the research is focused on and the goals of the research as well. And during the presentations, we also hope that both Professor Kazuto and Professor Stephen can give us suggestions for the research going forward. So, Ibu Yunita, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mas Aristio. The Honorable Director of Center for Aerospace Policy Studies, National Institute of Aeronautics and Space, LAPAN. Keynote speaker, Professor Kazuto Suzuki, Professor Stephen Freeland. Thank you for your time, professors, for joining us today. And ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yunita, represent my team here, would like to give overview of the research, and today we will like to give a brief overview, I think, with the title of Indonesia's role on space diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. And this is our team. There is Budini Businta, Mas Deden, and also Mas Joko and Mas Aristio and me here. And the next slide, please. And here, we would like to give background of the research here from the Space Asian Center and also Indonesia. We are recalling that outer space is very wealth of the non-material and material resources, and it is have the characteristic that free for exploring for all the countries without discrimination. It is just for peaceful purposes with the principle of non-appropriation. And also there's a lack of limited here because it is high tech, high risk, and high cost technology. So the access to it becomes limited for emerging space countries, but it also can be a domination by the spacefaring countries because there has more ability or capability in the science and technology of space. And here we can see together that space is becoming a strategic domain that is increasingly in all of the things here that we can give a three terms that it is the increasingly in a competitiveness, congested, and the contested area. And also there's increasingly in the dual use of natural space that blur the political demarcation responsibility about the peaceful and security itself. And also it is becoming strategic because of the global space economy value almost 140 billion dollars. And from the Asian century or the Indo-Pacific itself, we can see that Indonesia as the country or one of the top member in this region with Turkey and the others. And that we can see from this region is the space domain, not only for mitigating disaster or social economic benefit with the social development and others, but also for the national security itself. And why it is become for national security itself, because this region has a potential and real conflicts or a fragile state here. And also from the Indonesia's background here, we can see that Indonesia is strategic on the geographically and astronomically, that Indonesia needs a space technology to monitor, maintain, and utilize all land, water, and air areas as a whole, including all natural resources and also the human resources itself. And Indonesia also as the pioneer on the institutional because we have a space agency, LAPAN, in 1963, and also we are have increasing capability technique in space and space technology, and also we commit to develop our national arrangement to comply with the international guidelines or the international regulations. And the next slides, please. And we want to call this space diplomacy as common interest because in the era of the globalization, the world faces issues that cannot be resolved unilaterally. Urgent need for cooperation among major powers and all responsible countries to resolve these issues. So it is what happens in the Indo-Pacific. The major power and all responsible countries must be hand in hand together to tackle the issue in this region. And space diplomacy also one of the four pillars in the Unispace Plus 50 in 2018, and the objective of the Space 2030 Strategic Visions Agenda and the Implementation Plan approved at the UN compositions in 2021. And we can know that I mean the UN Corpus as the global institution for the space cooperation. It is like a mandatory to the region to have to comply with the UN Corpus agenda or the objective that must be achieved in the global. It must be achieved too in the region. And the third, space diplomacy in the meaning is the build partnership and strengthen international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. So what happened in the Indo-Pacific or in the Asian century itself, this region, we have to build partnership and strengthen international cooperation in the peaceful. That peaceful that we call here is the non-traditional threats such as the natural disaster, impact of climate change, cross-border smuggling, cybercrime, digital economy risk, and the others, and also about the SDGs, sustainable development goals that must be achieved together. So it is need the cooperation from the international side, and also the third things that we can have it the economic cooperations about the connectivity for business center or industrial part. So the dynamically cooperation has become a challenge here because we learn from the history and influenced by the ability of the every countries that very very long gap, I think. So we need to compromise or negotiate or what we call diplomacy here between the countries, between the business or between the people with G2G, B2B or P2B. And next slide, please. And how Indonesia's role on the regional space diplomacy here. We, in the existing here, we are the executive secretary of the UNSCAP, and we are the national focal point of the ICC sub UNSCAP itself. And as the executive committee and a group study of the NSLI PR5, and signatory countries of the EPSCO, members of the CSSTAP, RSSTAP, APM, SCOSA ASEAN, and others in this region. And we will have a space even in our country as a host in 2021 as in even our Space 20 and the UNSCAP. And in 2023, we are the host of the IPRSF. And also in this region, we have a bilateral agreement on space with the various countries, with the major powers and with the emerging countries too. And also we can highlight here that we are contribute in the UN Copos in the last years in 2018, 2019, we are as the first vice chair of the committee of the UN Caucus. And what we can expect from the Indonesia space diplomacy, we have a value here that we can divide on the 4 values. The first one is the politic value that we have independent and active foreign policy here. So it is make us brave to have a cooperations, and then we are naturally as natural leader of the ASEAN of the regions, and we are the pioneer of space agency and the space aid. We have the space aid 21 in 2013 years, and then in the strategic and economic value, as we said before, that geographically we are an archipelagic state, so we need the science and technology of the space, and also astronomically we are the equatorial state that it is give us blessed of the area that we have long of the geostationary orbit, and then if we achieve to build our spaceport, so it is will make us as the first not the first, the first equatorial spaceport in this region. So it is a very strategic economic value, and also we have populations that as not only as the market but also as the users of this application of this space. So it is a very strategic and economic value for them. And the third is the technical value. We have developed 8 until A2 until A5 satellite, and we have the nuclear chamber satellites control center, and we had remote sensing national data bank, and we have space-based decision system support platform, and also satellite launch vehicle development. So we can say that in the Asian region, we are the leader of the technical value of the space. And for the last it is the governance value that we have Foreign Affairs Act, and we have a Space Act, and also we have the presidential regulations that as the framework of our space master plan, and also we have the government regulations to rule about the remote sensing in these nations or in Indonesia itself. So that we can see here that Indonesia see that the space technology, it is a very valuable for the communication and security for the community, disaster mitigations through the availability of weather modifications and the others. So how we can see that this region is the place for make a greater cooperations internationally to make our common interest to have secure from the non-traditional trades, and from to achieve the SDGs, or to greater our economic side. So it is a strategic value for diplomacy. So we have to know how about the international perspective on that. And so now or today we have a Professor Stephen Freeland, Professor Suzuki Kazuto, to give insights or enlightenment in this research and give us a brief of how international perspective on the region or a prospect of the governance of space in the region, and also have the greater cooperation with the Indonesia itself. And lastly, I would like to close my presentation with want to make all of you know about our next agenda. It is a national seminar with the big theme is the space diplomacy itself. So, and we have a keynote speaker from the Foreign Minister of Republic of Indonesia and the others. So let's join us on SINAS KPA 2021 in September or in the next month. So I close my presentation with say that fasilitas nuklir antariksa untuk menjadi negara besar from President Soekarno. Thank you very much. I will give back to Mas Aristio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Yunita, for your brief presentations. I think you mentioned a lot of important points from our research and highlighting 4 important pillars of Indonesian space diplomacy, which are political values, strategic and economic values, technical values, and government, and also for raising the importance for the Indo-Pacific countries to cooperate in regard to enhance more space diplomacy in the regions. So thank you very much. So I think right now we go to the our center of the program, which is the presentations by our 2 distinguished speakers. But first, let me introduce our distinguished speakers. For those of you who are working on space policy issues, I think our 2 speakers really needs no introductions. But I would just briefly mention the background and the institutions here. So our first speaker will be Professor Suzuki Kazuto-san, who is a professor of science and technology at the graduate schools for public policy at the University of Tokyo in Japan. He graduated from the Department of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University and received his doctoral degrees from Sussex European Institute in England. Professor Kazuto-san's research focuses on the intersections between science and technology and international relations, and on the subjects including space policy, non-proliferations, export control, and sanctions. Thank you very much for being here with us today, Professor Suzuki. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And our second speaker would be Professor Stephen Freeland, who is a professor of international law at the University of Western Sydney and a visiting professor in international law at the University of Copenhagen. He's also a member of faculty of the London Institute of Space Policy and Law. Professor Freeland has also been a visiting professional within the Appeals Chamber at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and a member of the Australian delegations to the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and a special advisor to the Danish Foreign Ministries in matters relating to international criminal court. So we have a very distinguished professors here. So each of you will be giving your presentations for more or less 40 minutes. And then we hope that there will be a lot of discussions and comments from all these experts participants that's already joining us here in the room. So to all the participants, if throughout the presentations you have any questions, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. We will read it out during the Q&A sessions. So without any further ado, please let us welcome Professor Kazuto Suzuki. Professors, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aristotle. It is my pleasure to join this workshop organized by LAPAN, Indonesia. I am also grateful for Dr. Heru and Deden and Unita for organizing this, and I am very delighted to be invited. So my name is Kazuto Suzuki. Aristotle has already kindly introduced me. I am teaching science and technology policy, but mainly I'm focusing on the space policy, not only in Japan, but also space policies of the world in Europe, United States, and elsewhere. And I am also a member of the Space Security Subcommittee of the National Space Policy Committee. So I am involved in the policymaking processes, as well as a part of this space security subcommittee involves in the space diplomacy. So I think I can get you around what Japan is thinking on the space diplomacy and how we perceive the potential cooperation with Indonesia and other ASEAN countries. So let me just start sharing my slides. Right. So what I'm trying to talk about today is the sort of a general outline of the Japanese space diplomacy and how we see the Indo-Pacific region and what the importance of the Indo-Pacific region in our strategic thinking. So basically, the Indo-Pacific is the area where Japan is considered the most strategically important domain, and the concept of Indo-Pacific is uniquely Japanese, actually, because it was initially called the Asia Pacific, but the Prime Minister Abe in 2007 extended the concept of the Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific, which was the in the process of the conceptual strategic concept making after we have launched the idea of the arc of free and prosperity. The arc of free and prosperity is shown in this map, and this is the way in which that Aso administration in 2005 has initially the Foreign Minister Aso has launched in 2005. So this is the idea to secure the lane from Europe to Japan, and to make sure that we cover the important strategic area of the former communist regions of Europe, which is the eastern part of Europe, and which considered to be the most dynamic in terms of the economic growth. And then we covered Turkey, and then we have the Middle East, where we depend heavily on the oil, and then we cover the Indian Ocean to make sure that this is the secure route for oil and other transportation. And then we also consider heavily on the security of the South China Sea and South and West Pacific. So this geographical and geostrategic thinking has extended to the Indo-Pacific, which includes the arc of free and prosperity, which is shown here, but also includes the eastern part of the African continent, such as Kenya, Tanzania, Madagascar, etc. So that was the basic idea. And in particular, the Prime Minister Abe had in mind was the counterbalancing with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative was initially going through the road, which is going through the inland of the Eurasian continent. And also it goes to the belt, which is outside of this, which is overlapping with this arc of free and prosperity. And the strategic concept of the Indo-Pacific comes not only about transportation, but also the link of the group of countries which are which can share the same ideal, same values, and same norms. For example, the democracy, rule of law, and the freedom of navigation. Of course, not all states around the Indo-Pacific are democratic or the respecting rule of law, but the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, is to translate this region into more democratically friendly and respecting the rule of law state. So the Japan consider itself as the leader to promote these idea and to make sure that our strategic goal is to have the good communication with those states to accept these notions of the free and open Indo-Pacific and these value and normative ideas. So based on this free and open Indo-Pacific region, the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific means that it is free and open, so which is not exclusive to any countries. Often that this concept of free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, is considered to be a method to reject or isolate China, which is not true. And Japan put a strong emphasis on the free and open, which means any country which accepts the idea of democracy and rule of law would be able to join this group. In other words, if China become more democratic and more, respecting more rule of law, then we'll be happy to accept the FOIP framework. But currently, it is very difficult to say that China is a democratic state. So therefore, there is a tension between the concept of FOIP and China. Also, for the Japanese space diplomacy, the Sustainable Development Goals is another sort of a strategic objective to achieve through the space diplomacy. So FOIP and SDGs are the two main objectives to achieve the space diplomacy, and I think this is the most important element of how to build the space diplomacy. You need to have the conceptual goals, and to make things happen, we prioritize what we can do in terms of this cooperation with other countries, including Indonesia, to achieve the FOIP and the SDGs. And I think you all know what SDGs are, but SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, which are set by the United Nations. And based on the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals was derived from the concept of the human security, which was launched in year 2000 as the UN Committee on the human security, which was chaired by the Miss Sadako Ogata and Dr. Amartya Sen. And this was the Japanese concept provided to shape the goals of the United Nations. And this concept of human security turns into the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. And then after the MDGs have completed, then it is inherited to the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So SDGs are pretty uniquely, well, the space can contribute heavily on the SDGs. For example, the no poverty, zero hunger, the space can provide the information for, let's say, agricultural sectors to make sure that, you know, we avoid the droughts and the floods and make sure that, you know, we do have enough grains from field, good health and well-being. Japan and what space can do to monitor the change of climate and change of weather to make sure that the transmissible diseases will not be. We can foresee the potentials of the transmissible disease. The quality of the education, we will be able to provide the teleeducation, you know, using the satellite communications for remote areas. And I'm sure that there are some remote learning processes done in Indonesia because of the archipelago structure of the land. Clean water, sanitations, these are also monitored by space and provide the, you know, assess the water circulation. Clean energy, yes, the space can provide the vital information for the smart cities, smart grids. So, and the space will provide the potential for the solar power generations or wind power generations. Decent work and economic growth. The space itself is a big industrial potential for hiring more people. And in infrastructure, of course, space is an infrastructure and will inspire more innovation. Inequalities, the diminishing of poverty may reduce the inequalities, and sustainable city communities, and so on and so forth. Climate action, of course, the space will provide. Japan has put a greater emphasis on the monitoring climate change. We do have the GCOM-W, GCOM-C, and the GOSATs. These are all contributing to the climate change. And life on land, we can see the vegetation change and make sure that we'll be able to provide the enough, to monitor the deforestation. And peace and justice and strong institution, the peace, we may provide the monitoring for the movement of troops or verifying the arms control treaties. So there are lots of things that space can do for SDGs, and Japan is trying to include most of them in the context of space diplomacy, which means that if the cooperation can achieve for the further development of the SDG goals, then we'll be able to have better cooperation. and Japan will put more higher priorities if the cooperation schemes between Japan and Indonesia or other countries have the elements of promoting the SDG goals, promoting any goals of the SDGs. Also, what is interesting is that in 2008, Japan has established the basic space law, which has completely turned the space policy from traditional ones, which are focusing on the science and technology, to the focusing on the use of the technologies and use of the space infrastructure. So in this process, the space diplomacy became much higher priorities in the space strategy in Japan, and it becomes as the integral part of the national diplomatic strategy, and using space as the tool for the promotion of the Japanese international cooperation in general. So the FOIP and the SDGs are all inclusive in the space diplomacy effort. So what we do by the space diplomacy and the international cooperation, the primary importance is the implementation of international law and order by monitoring from space. So this is in the SDG terms, it's the SDG 15 about the peace and the stronger institutions, to make sure that we do have the secure sea lanes, and make sure that we will be able to guarantee the freedom of navigation. So in order to do so, we need to have the constant monitoring scheme. Japan itself has the various Earth observation satellites to monitor the movement of ships and the movement, trying to analyze the risks in the South China Sea and Pacific and all around the world. But also, what is important is the implementation of the international law. So the UN UNCLOS, the law of the sea, shall be respected, and make sure that we are monitoring for the violation of the international law, and also we are using the satellite imageries for monitoring the movement of the ships which are transferring to the goods to North Korea, for example, which is under the sanction by the UN Security Councils. So, so Japan is using both satellite imageries and also military aircrafts to monitor the movement of the ships, and trying to find Japan is taking pictures of the ship-to-ship transfer of the prohibited goods to North Korea, and we are providing. Japan is the #1 country to provide the evidences for the United Nations panel of experts reports. And the other point is the international cooperation for SDGs, and I think this is already covered, so I'll skip that. The establishing institutional relations with Indo-Pacific countries through APRSAF. The APRSAF has been a very strong instrument of the Japanese space diplomacy. The APRSAF stands for Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, and we have launched the various programs, including Sentinel Asia. And this is one of the multilateral cooperation and multilateral effort to provide the common information basis for all the participants of the Sentinel Asia, and to build the satellite to monitor the disasters and monitor the climate change. And Sentinel Asia is one of the achievement of the international cooperation through APR-SAF. But what we are now seeking is the potential programs beyond Sentinel Asia to have to use the APR-SAF as a vehicle for the further cooperation with the Asia-Pacific countries to build the platform for further information sharing, a scheme for disaster monitoring and deforestation, etc., etc. The space-based, so this is the another bullet on the space-based information for the disaster management. The disaster management is the major objective of the current Japanese space programs, which is to because Japan as well as Indonesia is prone to the natural disasters such as earthquake, tsunami, and volcano activities. So these are all very life-threatening and very serious natural disasters, and we are trying to develop the capabilities to monitor the areas where the disaster has hit and make sure that we will be able to provide the instant images for the areas that was hit by the disaster, and make sure that the satellite imageries will contribute to provide the wider picture of the impact of the disaster and provide the management. And it's not just the satellite-based, space-based information which is enough to manage the disaster. I think what is also needed is the ability to interpret the imageries and make sure that these interpretation will be carried out to the first responders, and make sure that these imageries will be used for the further planning for the recovery and the reconstructions. So this whole idea of the disaster management is not just build the satellite and provide imageries, but also building up the governing structure and information flow, and trying to establish the system of the disaster management. So it requires a lot of capacity buildings, but Japan is also having trying to build this package of the disaster management capacity building, and the space-based information will be included in this package. And further, I think there is a lot of opportunities for the other domains through technological transfers, because of the availability of the small sat technologies. And I think the Japan and Indonesia has already established the cooperation scheme for the technological transfer for the microsats and the small sats, and we have already developed the variety of policy tools to make sure that we'll be able to help the engineers and the university students to build up the satellite manufacturing and satellite developing capabilities of the ASEAN countries, including Indonesia. So these are also part of the Japanese space diplomacy to make sure that we'll be able to have a stronger connection and stronger relationship with countries in ASEAN, and to make sure that we'll be having the stable relationship because of this, the wider strategic relationship in the Asia, especially the strategic competition with China. It is extremely important for Japan to establish a stable relationship with the ASEAN countries. So how Japan sees the Indo-Pacific in terms of space. Japan sees the Indo-Pacific as the region of growth. Because of the economic growth, there is a lot of demand for the terrestrial and the space infrastructure, and there are a lot of countries with the island countries, archipelagic countries, so that the land-based terrestrial-based infrastructure may not be sufficient to provide the nationwide services such as education. And I think space will have a very good advantage of providing the telemedicine, teleeducation, and various other services to the people living in the different places and in different islands. So countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and also Japan needs to have these space-based capabilities and space-based infrastructure for the further economic growth. And I think this is the understanding in Japan, that the space-based infrastructure will connect not only the nationwide services, but also the international services or regional services. So programs like Sentinel Asia is one of the example that the satellite can provide not only for one country, but for all countries in the Indo-Pacific states. And I think this space will have a much wider potential to serve for the demand, the administrative and political demand and economic demand for these services. And we are also focusing heavily on this disaster prevention and disaster management, as I discussed. The Indo-Pacific is the focus of this area because we share a lot in common in terms of the nature of the natural disaster. And also because, for example, tsunami, if there is the earthquake in Indonesia, there will be a possibility that the huge tsunami comes to Japan. So we are all in this together, and Japan and Indonesia have really a lot in common to share the expertise and the best practices of how to deal with the disaster. We also find the Indo-Pacific is the area where there is a huge demand for the space science and technologies. I know that there are many countries, including Indonesia, that there are a lot of space engineers who are eager to learn about the new technologies, and will be happy to accept these students and engineers to learn and share the space technologies. And particular university level, like my university, University of Tokyo, provides a lot of opportunities for the international students to come and learn about the satellite technologies. And there are certain limitations on the launcher technology because of the missile technology control regime, but nevertheless, satellite has a less limitation for the technological transfer. So there will be a lots of opportunity for the technical cooperation. And also, Indo-Pacific is the area of the strategic competition with China, Japan, and United States and others. And Japan has been a part of the a group called Quad, which is the 4 countries: Australia, where Dr. Freeland comes from, and United States and India and Japan. So these 4 countries are now having the much deeper strategic cooperation in terms of the security and in terms of the other strategic objective. For example, the establishing a more secure supply chain networks, or of the strategic commodities such as vaccines or rare earths or semiconductors. So Indo-Pacific is the sort of an area of strategic competition from Japanese point of view, and it is also important that there should be the secure and stable relationship with ASEAN countries, because of the security of the supply chain and because of the security of the technologies, because there is a lot of concerns about the illicit technology transfer from Japan and via third countries to China. And so we need to establish much more stronger framework for the export control, and this is one of the reasons why Japan is conducting the Asia Export Control Seminar, which is to establish the sort of a global regional network of securing the transfer of technology, and Indonesia is the very constant participant of this seminar. Japan is, after the establishment of basic space law in 2008, Japanese decision-making on space has shifted to the Cabinet Office. So Cabinet Office is now the center of the decision-making, and under the Cabinet Office, there is a task force called the Overseas Task Force to have the strategic planning unit to make sure that Japanese space diplomacy have a good effect on the development of the partnership countries. So this task force is working with the other agencies like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, JAXA, and JICA, Japanese International Cooperation Agency. And this task force is the sort of a hub of the interagency cooperation in Japan for the space policies, and it is working very well. And this task force have the network of the embassies with the potential cooperation state, partnership state, and the embassies become as a contact points for the universities and user ministries of partnership countries. And the Overseas Task Force has already achieved certain success of the cooperation, such as the launching Mars probe of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates have launched the Mars probe as a fifth country to send a probe to the Mars orbit, and which was launched by the Japanese H-2A launcher. And this was one of the achievement by the Overseas Task Force, which connected the demand of the UAE and the supply of the Japanese launcher. Also, the Overseas Task Force has made the connection with the Vietnam to provide the two SAR synthetic aperture radar satellites to Vietnam. And also we do have the long-term cooperation roadmap and the maritime monitoring program with Indonesia. So these are the achievement of the Overseas Task Force. And JICA MOFA is providing by supporting the Overseas Task Force by providing the official development assistance, ODA, and also the task force is responsible for promoting the science and technological cooperation. For example, they are making all this arrangement for sharing the samples from Itokawa and Ryugu, which are taken as a sample from the asteroid by Hayabusa and Hayabusa 2. The Unisec is another unique attempt and organization of having a network of universities, which are originally coming from my colleague, Professor Nakasuka of the University of Tokyo. And there is something called the Unisec Global, which is the global consortium of the universities and sharing the idea and engineering cooperation. Also, my previous posting was the Hokkaido University, and Hokkaido University has the Professor Takahashi, who has developed the multi-spectrum sensors, and he has already built the satellite for Philippines and Myanmar. Unfortunately, because of the coup d'etat, the Myanmar satellite is in the orbit but not functioning yet. But it is functioning, but not providing services yet. But the Hokkaido University is planning to build the Asia satellite networks, which is to have the connection with the all ASEAN countries, and to monitor the plant disease and soil moisture, so that this will be the sort of a quickest way for building up the useful operational satellites through the university levels. This, by the way, the Hokkaido University has engaged not only just the university level, but also the university to government, so U2G relationship. Also, we do have the problem, the FOIP is the strategic idea, and there is a security element in it. And we do have the very strong concerns for the security of this area. So space can provide the services for the security information, and particularly for the security of the maritime domain awareness. And we also have the Quad state, the Japan, US, Australia, and India, for mission assurance, which means that when the satellite is malfunctions or satellite lost the services, then we'll be able to cooperate each other to provide the alternative services to other countries. So mission assurance is one of the points where Japan is trying to seek for the future, for the cooperation partners, and to have the similar capabilities and to provide the services when if there is malfunctions or any troubles with other satellites, then we'll be able to provide alternative services by using the different sets of satellites. Also, we do have very strong concerns about the security of space, which means that security in orbit or the sustainability to maintain the long-term sustainability in space. So Japan is building up the space situational awareness capabilities, and we are seeking the partners in the ASEAN countries for sharing the SSA capabilities, and also we are building up the counter space capabilities to deter ASAT attempts, which means that China has demonstrated in 2007 to shoot down a satellite. We think that these are very dangerous and very concerning attempts, and we need to deter these kind of actions to sabotage the satellite services. So we are now building up the capabilities to control and to protect those space assets. But the most important thing is to build up the international norm for the global commons, and Japan is taking a lead for building up the space rule of the law, and make sure that we will be able to have the group of ASEAN countries to support these international norms. But unfortunately, the discussion has not been promoted since 2015, and I think currently there is a new initiative taken by the United Kingdom. In December last year, the United Nations have adopted the General Assembly 7536, which is a resolution for all states to submit the responsibility in secure space environment. And this is another initiative that Japan is trying to support. And we are trying to build up the norms to be the responsible actors in space. So finally, in conclusion, Japan is actively engaging in the Indo-Pacific region and provide public goods such as Sentinel Asia. And Japan is trying to set up the international norms for safe and sustainable space environment. Free and open Indo-Pacific is a strategic interest for Japan. And building up the network of like-minded countries and to set up the stable and reliable relationship with those countries. And we are trying to take the leadership in this region as a technological leader. And this is part of the works of the Overseas Task Force is doing. And further, we are trying to use space-based technologies for preventing conflict and to set up the peaceful region in Indo-Pacific. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Suzuki-san, for your very interesting and important presentations, and also for keeping up the times to exactly 40 minutes. I read a lot of important points from your presentations, professors, but you covered a whole lot of things from the Japanese perspective on the Indo-Pacific, and then the importance of creating an institutional relations with the Indo-Pacific countries. And also I'm very much triggered with your points on the importance of setting up an international norms for the global commons, where you're also inviting ASEAN for support on that matter. the ASEAN, I think we endorsed the ASEAN Outlook on the Pacific, as you might know, in 2019. However, in the Outlook, it's quite unfortunate that it's not really mentioning out anything about the space and the importance of space. It's very much more focused on maritime domains. But as your presentations highlight, there's a lot of relations between the importance of space diplomacy, utilization of space technologies for maritime securities, as well as maritime domain awareness. Thank you very much, Professor Suzuki-san. We will very much looking forward to the discussion sessions. So the next speakers would be Professor Stephen Freeland, who will be talking more on the Australian perspective on the space diplomacy cooperations here in the Indo-Pacific. Professor Freeland, the screen is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much very much for the introduction. Thank you, Professor Suzuki, for a wonderful presentation. And let me give my sincere thanks to Dr. Heru, to Yonita, to Deden, to Lapan for inviting me to this wonderful event. I'm delighted to be here. Sitting here in Sydney. Of course, Indonesia is our close neighbor, our good friend, and we already cooperate in so many ways. And I look forward to working with you and helping for that to be promoted more. Let me also begin by wishing everybody who's listening all the best in these difficult times. I am sitting here in Sydney in lockdown. I've been in lockdown, I think, for 8 weeks now, and it's going to continue for some period. And I know Indonesia has had a very, very difficult period of time. So please stay safe, everybody, and stay well, and hopefully we can all move out of this together. Let me just very briefly tell you a bit about myself, although you don't want to hear too much. I will build on the themes that Professor Suzuki mentioned in terms of norms and law. I'm an international lawyer and an international diplomat and policymaker. I've worked with many countries to put together their national legislative frameworks for space, their national policy frameworks for space. So I've, for example, been involved very much in the drafting of the revised Australian space law, the New Zealand law, the Norwegian law, and many other countries. I sit on the advisory board of the Space Agency here in Australia, not as an employee, but as an independent advisor. I've just been appointed by the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to co-chair a 5-year working group that will be looking at the exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space resources, an issue that everybody has a stake in. And there will be incredible amounts of diplomacy required as we move forward in that regard. And the message that I want to give, and I'll share my screen in a minute, is several-fold. Firstly, the basis of diplomacy requires a respect for the fundamental principles that we already have in space. Those fundamental principles are all centered around responsible behavior, around peaceful uses, and around, and this is the mantra of the United Nations, the safety, stability, and sustainability of space. Point number 2 is the rule of law and the role of law is an integral platform that upon which diplomacy is based. If we don't have respect for law, if we don't have respect for the norms that have been created, are being created, will be created, then diplomacy suffers and struggles. So you need to have the platforms in place. And the third point I want to make is that every country has a stake in the development of norms. Every country has a stake and a role to play in terms of the diplomacy of space. It is not an area which is reliant solely on the diplomacy of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 large spacefaring nations. It is an area where we all have a stake. Indonesia has an incredibly important voice that has been heard often in the fora that I've attended, but must continue to be heard, along with every other country that has an interest in space. Indonesia has, I know, a rich history in space. And so space is vital for you, but space is vital for every country in the world. So the message I made is that this twin platform of the rule and role of law and the need to base on diplomacy based on those principles of peaceful sustainability, etc., go hand in hand, and they are important for every country. That's the basis upon which Australia and New Zealand and other countries have been basing their diplomacy. That's the basis, I think, for a country like Indonesia to continue all of the good work that Unita mentioned as she summarized the studies. Now, the scariest part always is to share one's screen, but there you are. I hope that you can see my screen. I will talk mainly from an Australian and New Zealand perspective in terms of the law, but I think I want to take it to a higher level and talk about global challenges, global issues, because I think that's where it's important for every country, and certainly for Indonesia, to continue its work in playing a role in the diplomacy. Why is it important? It's important because, and really, I think some of you in this audience around the world are perhaps not so familiar with space, but space is ubiquitous. Every country in the world, every community, every economy, every person in the world requires an access to the benefits that space can create. You and I, everybody in this audience, use space every day, 20 or 30 times without even thinking about it. And it's not just, well, if you can see that, it's not just the phone. It's not just the GPS in the phone, although of course that's important. It's so many things, and Professor Suzuki referred to some of them. It's disaster management. It's agricultural and mineral exploration management. It's transportation systems. It's critical infrastructure. It's national security. There are so many aspects to space. It's important as we develop these principles, as we work at our diplomacy, to ensure that we take note of all of the different facets of space. It's highly, highly political, and I'll delve into that a bit more. As Professor Suzuki also mentioned, it's imbued with national security and regional security and global security aspects. It's used by militaries around the world. It's a highly commercial area. I'll talk a little bit about that. Unita made reference to the global economy. Obviously, it's a legal area in terms of the norms and the rules and the treaties that we have. It's important for science exploration. It's important in so many other ways. It has cultural manifestations and religious and heritage manifestations. And it's incredibly important for raising the standard of living and preserving the standard of living of people in all levels of countries, from the most industrialized and most developed to the least industrialized and least developed countries. Frankly, space is inextricably tied to human rights and indeed the future of humanity. So it's important, therefore, as we move forward in the way that we put space diplomacy together, that we recognize that space is not a single focused aspect, it is multifaceted. And we have to ensure that as we develop our diplomatic policies, as we develop our space policies, our commercial, our legal, our scientific frameworks, etc., we recognize that we hear all of the different perspectives on space. You know, many of you I know are related to governments. You know that if you go to the different departments of a government, and I've done this many times in many countries, they will have different perspectives about what space is. So in my country, the agency is governed by our Department of Industry, and they see space as an area for jobs and revenues and creating industry. And then if you walk down the road to our Department of Defense, they see space as something very different. They see it with national security eyes and military eyes, and they're not necessarily interested in having private sector involvement. Whereas, of course, our Department of Industry, that's what it wants. And then if you walk down the road again to your Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they see space in a different perspective yet again. It's about cooperation. It's about adhering to your international obligations. And then if you walk down the road to your finance department, your treasury, they will see space in a different aspect again. You know, it's costly. How does it work? Should we be devoting resources to that instead of perhaps other types of technology? So you can see even within one country, you need to balance these different voices. So globally, there are many voices, but we do that. We need to do it. But I think the important point is sometimes you will hear some speakers talk about space in very binary terms, and that there's a one-size-fits-all solution and one-size-fits-all diplomacy for every point. My argument, perhaps you agree, perhaps you don't agree, is that it is far more complex and nuanced than that, and you need to ensure that you understand the different perspectives. Okay, originally, as you know, space was about states in the early days. But if you fast forward to now, there are, of course, many different actors in space. States, countries are still, of course, incredibly important for a lot of the reasons that Professor Suzuki referred to. But there's also, for example, now universities. There's a very broad intergovernmental organizational involvement, and I'll come back to that soon. And there's an expanding commercial sector. So in 2020, the global space economy was valued, give or take, at about $385 billion US. But here's the point about that. That number has been growing at between 8 and 10% for the past 7-8 years. And even during the darkest times of COVID, the global space economy continues to grow. It's one of the very few, if you like, microeconomies that have grown during the darkest period of COVID. The others being, for obvious reasons, the pharmaceutical industry, and the other being, I don't know how you describe it, the digital industry like Netflix and things like that. And the space economy has grown, even during the darkest times. And it will continue to do so. Even as the global economy begins to recover, the space economy will continue to grow at 3 or 4 or 5 times the broader global economy. Depending on which investment bank you believe, I was an investment banker for 15 years before becoming an international lawyer. The global space economy will be in the trillions of dollars very soon. My country, Australia, our space agency is driven, one of its KPIs, remember I said, it's monitored by our Department of Industry, which is about jobs, which is about growth, which is about revenue. So one of the KPIs, key performance indexes of our space agency in Australia, is to triple from what it was approximately 4 billion Australian dollars in about 2011, 2012, to triple that to $12 billion by 2030. I also mention there, the New Zealand space economy has grown exponentially, although it's quite small, a lot smaller than Australia, but will grow for various reasons that I'll refer to. I won't bore you with the law, but I think it's important for those who perhaps, and forgive me for those who, this is Space Law 101, but I think it's important for those that aren't familiar so much with space, that for various legal reasons, for various reasons about how states reacted when in 1957, which was an important year for space. The first human-made object, Sputnik 1, was launched by the Soviet Union into Earth orbit and orbited the Earth for approximately 3 months. 1957, I always say this, is also important for me because I was born in 1957. So I am a Sputnik baby, so I have to talk about Sputnik, of course. But as a result of the way we reacted to Sputnik, and this has then been codified in principles and in treaties, unlike airspace, of course, the airspace above Indonesia is within the sovereignty, the territorial jurisdiction of Indonesia. Indonesian law applies to the airspace above Indonesia. If you think of outer space being above airspace, Indonesian law does not apply to the outer space above its territory. Airspace is within national jurisdiction. Outer space is an area beyond national jurisdiction. It is not governed by national law. I do not need anyone's permission to go to space. I need permission if I go into your airspace. I do not need your permission if I go to the outer space above you. And that's important. So international law governs outer space. The important point there, and Indonesia has been very vocal on this particular issue in COPOS, and I've had the privilege of being part of the Australian delegation for 11 years now at COPOS, and I've got many friends in Indonesia, and the Indonesian delegation has had a very strong and logical and cogent voice. And on this point, they've been very strong. The point is there a demarcation between airspace and outer space? Is there an upper limit to the sovereignty of Indonesia that you can point to, recognizing that if you're in the outer space, you are beyond Indonesia's sovereignty? And the answer is, we don't know the answer. We still don't have a demarcation point between airspace and outer space. It's not a legal problem. It's not a scientific problem. It is a political problem. The main reason being that, for all intents and purposes, and I generalize here, the larger spacefaring countries, the more powerful, do not want that upper limit to sovereignty. Whereas other countries, and Indonesia, as I say, has been very strident in its views, has said, we need to demarcate. Let's find a way. And in fact, Indonesia, by reference also to your national law, has proposed approximately 110 kilometers above mean sea level as a demarcation. Now, that is not the law. We do not have that answer, but you can see the politics of this is really the only sticking point. So Professor Suzuki made reference to COPOS. This is Boardroom D in Vienna, where COPOS and the legal subcommittee and the scientific and technical subcommittee meet. If you look very closely, I'm sitting right at the very front there because Australia has the benefit of sitting on the front row because of the alphabetical order, and Indonesia is typically in the row behind me and slightly to my right, but not very far away. But sadly, we were not in Boardroom D this year for scientific and technical subcommittee or legal subcommittee. And the plenary of COPOS is just about to meets beginning on the 25th of this month. Very few will be in this room. Again, it will be a hybrid meeting. In fact, I am chairing my working group meetings via hybrid, and that gives rise to some interesting issues, which I won't bore you with now, but diplomacy by virtual means is a lot harder than diplomacy face-to-face, or where you have the opportunity to have coffee on the margins. COPOS is one of the largest committees in the UN. It now has 99 states members and is growing fast. Australia, India, and Japan were founding members in 1959, but it's grown very quickly. Every year we get 3 or 4 new states. When I first started representing Australia about 10 years ago, I think there were about 65 member states. Now there are 99, and that's continuing. And that's just showing, again, the broad reach of space amongst a whole range of countries. And have a look at this screen. I've highlighted some in the near regions, some of those countries, but just look at the diversity of the membership. Diplomacy is so crucial when you have such a diverse grouping of member states, remembering that the decision-making capabilities, and many decisions have been made, the decision-making is done on the basis of consensus. So diplomacy is everything in the way that these discussions are carried out. Indonesia has been a member, a strong member since 1973. As I said, it has a strong voice. It also is part of the geopolitical groupings. So the G77 plus China also makes statements on behalf of its members, as do the other groupings like GRULAG, etc. So it's highly diversified, different interests, capabilities, capacities, but they all have one thing in common: their interest in space, their reliance on space, and the need, as I say, for them to work together, to cooperate, to engage in diplomacy, to ensure that we can continue to utilize space. Of course, achieving consensus, some of you are very seasoned diplomats, you know that consensus is a really difficult thing. I hope you have some sympathy for me, because I now, in my next 5 years, have to continue to help the member states achieve consensus on a really complex issue like the exploration, exploitation, and utilization of resources. Consensus, of course, is an interesting concept, but it's crucial, notwithstanding that there are critics of it, it's crucial that we engage in a consensus base, because you need to have buy-in from every state. As you engage and move forward, what you must avoid is the possibility for a state to say, well, I had no opportunity to be involved. This was not an inclusive process. I therefore do not support it. I'm therefore in a position where I can, if you like, exercise a veto type power. So we need to engage. And that's where it's important that every country engages with its friends, with its allies, with its regional neighbors, in the way in moving forward in a particular path. So as well as COPOS, there are, as I mentioned, a whole range of other intergovernmental organizations. I mentioned just 3 here that are relevant for the region. The Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization based in Beijing. And you can see that some regional countries are member states of that. One that perhaps you may not be so familiar with, Inter-Sputnik, which has its main roots in Russia and through the stans, if you like, all of the countries. But Vietnam, in India, DPRK and Laos are also a member of that IGO. It's mainly a communications IGO, but they're operators. And then, and Professor Suzuki and others have mentioned the Asia-Pacific Regional Agency the Space Agency Forum. I would refer you to the UN document. I've got the credentials of the document there. This was the latest paper submitted by APRISAF to the legal subcommittee just a month and a half ago, and it's got a wealth of information about cooperation, about exchanges of information, about really important issues that deal with the regional countries. And of course, Indonesia, as well as Australia and Japan, of course, were very strong participants. Its agencies were engaged in that process. This is not a talk about law and the intricacies of law, but I would not be doing my job, and it's an important part of the thematic that I'm saying about diplomacy needs the platform of the rule of law. Diplomacy needs the platform of understanding that we have incredibly important principles that have been developed through the COPOS by consensus, through a process where there's been diplomacy up front and center with every member state to get to the point where we have a series of treaties. You'll see that those treaties began already in 1967, before the first moon landing, which I think some people sometimes ignore. We had the law before the moon landing, which of course we celebrated quite recently an anniversary of. That's important because a lot of the principles in these treaties, which have meant that space has remained peaceful, it's worked largely, notwithstanding challenges, was the fact that in 1967 and into that 10-year period from Sputnik leading up to then, it wasn't clear, for example, who was going to win that race in terms of landing on the moon first. And indeed, if you look at the history books, as late as 1966, it appears now from the archives that the Soviet Union was actually, if you like, ahead in that race. And only when the leader of the Soviet space program, Kolotov, died in '66 and was replaced by others who perhaps made some strategic mistakes, that the United States was able to propel itself, and ultimately the rest is history. So the treaties based around the Outer Space Treaty and then the subsequent treaties which put flesh, if you like, on the fundamental principles are all around the idea that everybody should cooperate, that we need to maintain space as a peaceful domain largely. For various, again, political reasons, we haven't had another treaty since 1979, which was about the thorny issue at that time of space resources. And as I said, that's now come back again, but in a much more inclusive process that we're having in COPOS through the working group. But we've had a whole range of other, people call it soft law, I don't like the expression, but soft law instruments that Indonesia has participated in the debates. And of course, the emergence of national law. Indonesia has strong national law, and I know is continuing to work on further national law. I've had the privilege of helping about 11 or 12 governments develop or reform or work on their national frameworks and national laws. We now have somewhere between 30 and 40 countries with national law, and that's growing. The soft law instruments that I mentioned, just again, to demonstrate the point that there's a lot of principles around, are really important. And I've highlighted a couple of ones there that are particularly relevant for countries like Indonesia, indeed for every country. The latest being the long-term sustainability guidelines of 2019, but also we have the debris mitigation guidelines, which Indonesia is engaged in terms of implementation, and resolutions about developing countries and national legislation. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about national law, because the national framework, as I say, is the basis for the diplomatic framework and the policy framework. Obviously, the national legislative framework should reflect the policy, should reflect your diplomatic stance, but you need to have it there as a platform to give you the gravitas, to give you the ability to then exercise your diplomacy. And international space law through these treaties that I've mentioned give rise, and Indonesia is a state party to 4 of those treaties. So they have a whole series of rights and a whole series of obligations under those treaties. If you look, and I've just picked 4 examples, but there are many more. If you look at the international treaties, just by being a party to it, Indonesia has obligations, in a sense, within its national framework to implement various ideas. So countries have national frameworks, of course, because of this increasing commercialization of space, or this increasing notion that non-governmental entities are engaged in space. And so every country is under an obligation, but also I think it's in its interest to regulate in a proper way the activities of its non-governmental entities. Indonesia does that through your Space Activities Act. But as I said, you're looking at other legislation now. But also that's a requirement of implementing various obligations that Indonesia has as a good international citizen, as a party to these treaties. So you can see there is this two-way street between international frameworks and national frameworks. And so when you put together your national frameworks, it's always a balancing act. And as I said, I've worked with many countries as they develop or reform or change or draft their national frameworks. You ask them the same questions, but the answers for every country will be different because the unique experiences and requirements and risk profiles and capabilities of each country will be different. But it's a balancing act as you put your national frameworks together and upon which you base your diplomacy and your policy. On the one hand, you obviously want to be good international citizens, as Indonesia is, and implement and comply with your obligations, protect the environment, preserve your national interests, maintain your cooperative international relations. And then on the other side of the ledger, and this will depend on each country, you want to encourage industry and commercialization and develop revenues. You want to make, therefore, the fact that non-governmental entities are now being engaged in space, you want to make your jurisdictional requirements, your legislative requirements streamlined and user-friendly and understandable and practical. But obviously, in the end, you will put together the legislative framework that is in the best interests of your country, depending on a whole range of different variables, but you will try to balance this. So let me talk briefly about Australia and law. And again, on the basis of that law, we're engaged in diplomacy. So we, Australia, were one of the earliest countries to develop a national legislative framework. Way back in 1998, we had law. We were the 6th or 7th country, only the 6th or 7th country in the world to have national space law. As I said, now there are about 30 to 40 and growing. Our Space Activities Act of 1998 was developed around this notion that Australia would become a major launch service provider. Around this time, as the commercialization of space in the 1990s really began to blossom, there was great demand for the launching of commercial satellites, but less supply in terms of space launches. And so Australia was looked upon as the possibility. The Australian government at the time thought we could create a launch service industry. The Act was put together around that and developed a very sophisticated licensing regime. The only thing that happened was we didn't develop the launch capability for a whole range of reasons. But we had this legislation which allowed Australian satellite operators, particularly communication satellite operators, to launch their geostationary satellites from other places because there was a license framework in place. Anyway, as the nature of the Australian industry has changed due to the changing technology, there was pressure brought to bear by the industry upon the government saying, Our law is out of date. It caters to large companies with large balance sheets launching large rockets. But the nature of the industry has changed, particularly due to militarization, but not only. And so in 2015, the government appointed me to put together a report about how to reform our law. I developed my report, pardon me, submitted it to government in 2016, and through that process, other consultations then followed from my report, and the government amended the law in 2018, which came into force in 2019. I won't bore you with the details, but just to illustrate here, we have a very sophisticated licensing regime. Depending upon the activity you want to engage in, you will apply for particular licenses. Depending on the activity, you may have to provide insurance or whatever as well. Again, I can go into the detail, although if anyone asks. I also was involved in drafting the New Zealand law. So New Zealand initially didn't see itself as a major spacefaring nation, but an opportunity arose. An American company headed by a New Zealand CEO called Rocket Lab came to the government, said, we want to build a launch facility in New Zealand. Government working with the United States, because it was a US company, even though it was led by a New Zealander. The New Zealand government worked with the US government. The launch facility was licensed. No, it was built, pardon me, but the government had no national law. And so they again came to me and asked me to work with them to draft their national law. They came to me in the beginning of 2016. We worked for about 18 months. We drafted the law, which came into force then in December 2017, called the Space and High Altitudes Activities Act. So, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So my last two slides, Aristo, I'm almost there because I know time is moving on, is really the challenges. So Professor Suzuki, in his wonderful presentation, talked about specific opportunities where Indonesia can play a role in its diplomacy. I completely adhere to that. But I also think it's equally important for Indonesia to play an incredibly important role and have a voice along with others, but have a voice meeting the challenges as we move forward, because we all have a stake in space. And so the challenges are manifold. Most of the challenges revolve around the development of space technology, allowing for a greater array of activities. And we need to therefore create the frameworks, create the instruments in whatever form, create the norms, as Professor Suzuki said, create the understandings to allow us to move forward on some of these activities in an appropriate way. I will make these slides will be made available, by the way, to everybody through Lapan. They have a copy. So I apologize, there's many words on here, but the slides will be made available. But some of these challenges, space debris is our greatest challenge. And we really need to work hard on that. The militarization of space. Space has always been used for military purposes terrestrially, but we're now hearing rhetoric about space being a warfighting domain and weapons in space. We need to address that. We need to address congestion issues. We need to address other types of activities. Human spaceflight. Indonesia has some involvement already in beginning to put humans in space and has engaged in activities with the International Space Station as well. Space traffic management and space situational awareness that Professor Suzuki referred to. What do we do about the well-publicized plans of companies that you know well in the next 10 years to launch, let's say, 100,000 objects into space? Just to put that in perspective, since the day I was born in 1957, we have probably launched about 10,000 things into space, although there are now many, 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 many pieces of debris. developed through explosion and collisions. But we've only launched 10,000 objects into space since 1957, since my lifetime. If those plans of those companies and some countries come to fruition in the next 10 years, we will be launching 10 times that number of objects into space. And we really need to deal with those challenges. And then my last point really relates to the New Zealand legislation. As you develop your frameworks, as you develop your diplomacy, remember that there's this area between what you might regard as commercial airspace. So you're in Indonesia Civil Aviation Authority, the equivalent thereof would be monitoring, let's say, commercial airspace up to about 20 kilometers above. And space, even though we don't know the demarcation, is generally regarded as being certainly no lower than about 80 to 100 kilometers. So you still have that area in between. And there's a lot of technology going on there. And so in the New Zealand law, they are the first country in the world to also license what they call high altitude platforms, as well as space activities. My last slide, how do we meet those challenges? What should be the hallmark of diplomacy? And I have three overarching principles. The first is this: notwithstanding the rhetoric and geopolitics, which clearly is important in a whole range of ways, we can't avoid it. These are difficult geopolitical times. Notwithstanding that, all of the countries in the world have far more in common than they have differences in space. And that commonality means if we get it wrong, we all will suffer. Just like with climate change, everybody suffers, although those countries that will suffer the most perhaps will be the less developed countries, at least initially. If we get it wrong in space, we all suffer if we make space unsustainable. But who will suffer the most? It'll actually be the larger countries, because they have the greatest capabilities in space, the greatest, therefore, dependency on space, and therefore the greatest vulnerabilities. So it's diplomacy moving towards a recognition of common interests that will help us move forward in a way that will maintain sustainability. It's diplomacy based on the recognition of that relationship between the humanity of space and the future of humanity on Earth. And I don't mean millions of people flying off. I mean that if we had a theoretical day without space today, every country would suffer, every community would suffer, your infrastructure would collapse, and that would have incredible effects on the lives, the livelihoods, and the human rights of individuals. Space is about humanity. And the third point, and then I will stop, Aristio, is that we have a custodial relationship with space. We are stewards. And I know people say, well, that's very high level, and what can I do to make a difference? But we all must recognize that space is fragile and we need to respect it. It provides us with incredible benefits. But diplomacy should be around beginning to understand not just what is in the narrow national interests, although of course that's important, but what activities perhaps are in the broader interests. Because at some point we may have to begin to pick and choose and prioritize what sort of activities make sense and what sort of activities perhaps should be a lower priority in terms of space, because we need to ensure that we don't replicate the problems and the mistakes that we have had on Earth. And we certainly want to ensure that we don't do anything that will lead to conflict. With those sentiments, I thank you so much for your attention. I thank you again for inviting me to speak. And I'll look forward to your questions together with Professor Suzuki. Aristio, thank you for giving me the floor, and I'll pass it back to you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Freeland, for the very, very insightful and interesting presentations. I do learn a lot, and I read a lot of points from your presentations. I totally agree with you that a couple of things that is very important issues for the space going forward is about the space debris. as well as the security militarizations of the outer space. So thank you very much. We do have a lineup of questions here, but before I read some of the questions, we are very delighted to have His Excellency's Mr. Andre Omar Siregar, who is a Indonesian Consul General for in Houston, Texas, who would give some comments, because he's working on space issues as well, and we're delighted for him to give comments or insights on the issues. So I'm inviting Pa Andre to the stage.
Thank you so much, Pa Aristio, and I apologize to crash on your discussions. Thank you, Pa Roberto Heru, Pa Deden, and it's a real privilege for us. It's only about 11 p.m. in Houston right now, but when I've been talking to the chief of LAPAN this morning and also the friends from LAPAN, and I was just telling them, our consulate general here deals with NASA, and I'm observing Jeff Bezos launching his rockets, and then Elon Musk launching his rockets, and I've been getting a lot of discussions with Indonesian students doing aerodynamics, Pa Aristio. So there is a lot of desire to know when will Indonesia join the space race, Professor Stephen and also Professor Suzuki. And as I watched the presentations by LAPAN last week, Roberto, we have a lot of ambitions, and yet I think Professor Freeland reminded us the basic foundation of, if we're going to join in this race, where do we have to go? I won't speak long, Pa Aristio, but just to try and add a bit of context in our discussion, because this discussion is especially unique, because we've got Professor Freeland and Professor Suzuki also talking about Indo-Pacific. Previous to being Consul General in the past 6 months, Pa Deden, Pa Aristio, I was the Director for Regional Cooperation in APEC, IORA, and I helped with the IWEP, or the Indo-Pacific Cooperation. And before that, Professor Freeland, I was the consul in Darwin, where we were concerned about China and North Korea, and the U.S. Marines were there. Pa Aristio, maybe you know. And at the end of the day, it's all geoeconomics. When I was Director for Regional Cooperation, I was also in the Pacific Island Forum summits. And there, I think it was Australia who came to us asking about how China is influencing Vanuatu, influencing Timor-Leste. And there's a geoeconomics involved in this, and the security. And I think what Professor Suzuki reminded us is that when you talk about space diplomacy and the Indo-Pacific, it's easy, Pa Aristio, it's easy not to try and, let me rephrase this. It's not easy to ignore the role of China and Russia in the region in this new space race. And I think Stephen reminded us that at the end of the day, this space race has begun. The Indo-Pacific discussion is continuing, even though, Pa Aristio, everyone's focusing on COVID, but Ibu Menlu just returned from Washington a few days ago. And there we discussed about the Indo-Pacific and the role of the US and Indonesia in addressing this. And one of the comments was, right now we can focus on the vaccine diplomacy and collaboration. But the reality is, we did update her about this new space race. We did note that China and Russia is not holding back. And I think Professor Suzuki reminded us, at the end of the day, space diplomacy is not far from monitoring what's happening in the South China Sea. I would probably just briefly say, Pa Aristio, that with LAPAN's vision for 2030, we have a lot of ambitions to go in that direction. And I want to appreciate Roberto's the presentation by Ibu Yunita. It's a beautiful framework of how Indonesia should move forward. But for me, as now I'm no longer dealing with geoeconomics, Pa Aristio, I'm looking at the concrete stuff, Roberto's. When is LAPAN going to join NASA to send the Indonesian to space? As much as I'm sure our colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and LAPAN will participate in INCOPAUS, and I think the last meeting in May in Vienna, which was virtual, Pa Aristio, we had a lot of frameworks involved. But the reality is, if we talk too broadly about things, are we really getting ready to join the space race? One thing I have to remind is that in 2045, and I think Professor Freeland would agree, I think it was forecast that by 2045, Indonesia will be the top economy in the top 5 with the US, with China, with India, and of course, Australia is a strategic partner. But the reality is, Pa Aristio, as we hope to reach the top 5 economies, are we going to be doing what we're doing today, more on consumer goods, or are we going to invest in space diplomacy. We are involved in space diplomacy, but are we really getting more students like Ibu Yunita Sari, who's actually who's fired up about how we, as the geographic country in the Southeast Asia, Pa Robertus, we're supposed to be able to have that launch pad. And I'm glad that Lapan has a watch station in Kupang. But is every Indonesian student familiar with this? And in this regard, I'm just going to continue facilitating discussions at the multilateral level. I'm sure Professor Freeland and Professor Suzuki are keeping an eye on how we're progressing. But one thing, I'm hopeful that Lapan will not only look in the framework, but create the ecosystem for more students like UNITA to go to Houston, to NASA, to Blue Origins. We have many Indonesians that work in Blue Origins, Pak Aristio. They work, and we have Indonesians that work in SpaceX. But of course, as you know, the regulations in the US, you have to be an American citizen, and we even have even have an aerospace professor in Tennessee that teaches about this. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect, Pak Aristio, and maybe Pak Robertus, you might agree. And how can Lapan and the government and even foreign affairs can bridge together that collaboration so that this is my daughter, so that in the next 20 years, our students like Ibu Yunita, you can be those Indonesians who are maybe joining Jeff Bezos or at least part of the space race. But other than that, just finally on the Indo-Pacific, Bapak, the Indo-Pacific will still continue to be part of our diplomacy. It will still be part of Ibu Menlu's priority. And I think this is where Professor Freeland and Professor Suzuki, we need to not only look at the framework, but really to get, as mentioned by Professor Suzuki, the education cooperation. And so I want to give a special appreciation to not only LPDP and also to UI and to BRIN and to LPD, to Lapan. We need to start regenerating, Pak Aristio. This discussion is very, very good, but what's the way forward? I think next week Ibu Menlu will be speaking on this topic, but let's start getting at the pragmatic level. Hopefully with Australia and Japan, we'll have some quick capacity building collaboration. I don't think we'll be part of the Quad anytime soon, but there is, I know America and Japan and Australia has an interest for us to bridge with China and Russia. So unless we're going to be left behind, and Ibu Yunita is going to give a great presentation about space and yet never go to space, I think we have a big responsibility, Pak Deden, and hopefully Professor Suzuki. I really appreciate the things that you presented, and God willing, from the Foreign Affairs, we can facilitate that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency and Omar, for your very insightful and thought-provoking comments. I think I'll agree with you that Indonesia really needs to have more exposures on space issues. I have two of my friends who are studying at MITs, and he also work on a space issue. I think it's really, really great. So thank you very much, Pa. I think our colleague from Lapan, Pak Heru, Pak Deden, notes a lot of things from your remarks, and we will put it more concern on that particular issue. So there has been a lot of questions here on the line. So I will read the questions one by one. First, for Professor Kazuto from our researchers here, Ms. Ayu, it seems that the intergovernmental organizations, APSCO versus APSARF, also complete another depends on the interest of the initiator. Would you please share your comment on this? Is there any relations between the current conflict in the Indo-Pacific and the long conflict histories among East Asian countries? Thank you very much. Professor Kazuto, you have a comment on that?
Right. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Ambassador, for your insightful comment. And it was a very encouraging and very exciting to see the dynamics of the development of Indonesian space. And I think it is, I fully agree that you need to develop an ecosystem, not just for the framework, but the ecosystem of, how to build the capacity inside and outside of the country. By the way, I just wanted to make one comment for the ambassador's remarks. The joining a space race is not like a space race between the United States and Soviet Union, because currently the game has changed. The game is there is a country like China where the state is focusing on being the first in many domain and trying to establish the space capability through the national framework, whereas in United States there are a lot of private opportunities and private entities which are not for the reasons of the national competition, but for their own benefits and for their own businesses. So the space is no longer in the sort of a same track, in between United States and Soviet Union, they are racing the 100-meter dash, from the same start point. But now people are, playing a soccer and the baseball. The United States is playing baseball and China is playing soccer. So it's a different game that they're playing. So which part of the race that you want to join, you need to figure out, you need to have a strategy to find which sports do you like to play. It requires a completely different sets of skills. Whether to play baseball and play soccer, you have a completely different training. So what is your objective is the most important thing to understand. And in that context, I think the APR-SAF and APSCO are totally different things. By the way, China is the member of APR-SAF. China is allowed to participate in APR-SAF, which they don't, but the door is always open. It's the same idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan is setting up this as the forum, which means that everyone can join, everyone can, achieve by, by cooperating each other. If you don't have any intention to cooperate, then you won't come. But if you think that cooperation is beneficial to you, then you can come. So that's the forum is just a forum where the Japan opens the forum, but it's not for competition. It's for providing the opportunities to meet and discuss and develop the ideas and to make sure that there will be a potential for the international cooperation. Whereas APSCO is an institutional international organization, a treaty-based organization. So whether you want to join, you have to obey the rules, you have to contribute financially, and you have to play with the rule books. And that's the different thing. And we are not competing with APSCO. APSCO is APSCO. Do whatever you want. And I know that Indonesia is a member of it, and I think there is no harm of participating both APSCO and APR-SAF. So it's not a conflict. I mean, the people try to put everything in a conflict context, but not everything is in conflict. And yes, in addition, Japan is not trying to make a conflict. I mean, of course, China is a big country and capable and very, if there is a conflict, they are more resourceful. So what we are trying to do is to mitigate the level of conflict and try to not elevate the conflict. And for the reason why we are proposing the idea of the FOIP is to reduce the tension and reduce the conflict and reduce the friction and to open up the possibility of dialogues. Whether you join or not, it depends on China and the other country. I mean, the FOIP is free and open. So at the end of the day, it's not competition, and we are not trying to, we are fully aware of the risks. So technology transfers, too much dependency on the Chinese supply chain is the problem, or is the risk. But we are also having, China is the largest trading partner. So it's not in the context of the conflict, it's the mitigation of the risks. And that's different from the international competition of the APRSAF and the APUSCO. Of course, you know, APRSAF and APUSCO are both focusing on the international framework for the region, and you may say it's a competition of the leadership, but it's not a conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Suzuki, for your remarks. I think I agree with you that it's not very intention from Japan to contain China in regards to Indo-Pacific. It's more on the cooperations between like-minded states who have respect for democracy and the rule of law in the regions. So thank you. So the next question is from Ms. Sinisuka to Professor Stephen Freeland. What is your thoughts and pro and cons about implementing a quota for every country to utilize the outer space? For example, a number of durations of satellites operating from a countries that are more equitable usage of the outer space. So that is the questions. But I also welcome you if you want to give a comments to Pa Andre Omar's remarks, Professor Stephen.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Firstly, thank you, Ambassador, also for your insightful comments there. And you've got a lovely daughter as well, so it's lovely. Can I just follow on from firstly, and I will come back to the question, this notion of space race as well, and when will Indonesia join? As I said in my remarks, and I did some research, your country has a rich heritage in space. You know, you've had satellites going up for a long time, and this is something actually that I see in my country as well. We've had an incredibly rich heritage in space, and yet I was looking at a document just yesterday in my capacity as on the advisory board of the agency, and somebody had described Australia as an emerging spacefaring nation. And I took issue with that, and I said, you know, we've been involved in space activities for decades, for my lifetime and longer. Indonesia is not, you know, looking to join the space race. Of course, there's a lot of hype, and if I can use this word, apologies, sexiness about all of these different things we see in space. But Professor Suzuki is absolutely right. Remember in my remarks, I said, you know, I work with many governments to develop their policy, their framework, their diplomacy. I asked them the same questions at the beginning, but the answers are very different. And the way they develop their frameworks will depend on their capacity, their interests, their industry, their risk profile, their geopolitics, their values, their culture. And so you cannot be all things to all people. My country, Australia, for example, has no, as yet, indigenous capability, national capability of satellites apart from communication satellites. We don't have national Earth observation satellites. We don't yet, notwithstanding the legislation of 1998, have an indigenous launch capability. And we look across at New Zealand with some jealousy and envy there. So we have to pick and choose what's important for us, because in the end, notwithstanding my remarks at the end of my comment, governments, you know, you elect governments to do the best for their country, right? My point is, doing the best for your country can often mean you have to look more globally, but your first interest is the best for the country. You have to pick those elements of space where you have capability or desire, where it's in your best interest, where you have niches, where you perhaps have, and this is a horrible expression governments have taught me, leapfrogging technology, because it's a really competitive world there. Every country in the world is going through these same discussions that Indonesia is going through, that Australia is going through. There are webinars going on every day in every country about how do we, you know, how do we maximize and develop our capabilities. And so, but don't, in a sense, as Australia does as well, don't denigrate what you have already. You know, you have an incredible history, you have incredible expertise. The question for Indonesia, as it is for Australia, is to where to devote its resources to in the best interests of the country and therefore also in the best interests of the global economy. That was my message. But I think it was very interesting to hear your perspectives, and I hope that endorses everything that you've said. Thank you also for the question. A fundamental principle about space is, and remember I said in my remarks, I do not need anyone's permission to go to space. I mean, I need to be licensed, right? But an Australian entity does not need the permission of Indonesia and vice versa to go to space. And that's encapsulated in the treaties that the exploration and use of outer space is essentially free for all, free access. Obviously subject to the principles, you know, peacefulness and no nuclear weapons, etc. But there's free access. And so to impose a quota would go contrary to that whole idea of freedom of access. So it's not a possibility. That said, the question also made context to the equitable access of space. And that's an incredibly important context because, of course, I could say, let's say that that space is a big bowl of nasi goreng, and I'm sitting here and I'm eating it, and I invite Dr. Heru, and he's coming, and we're both eating, and then UNITA and the ambassador and Professor Suzuki say, wait a minute. Stop eating all of that nasi goreng, because by the time I come to the table, it'll all be gone, or all the good bits will be gone. And Dr. Heru and I say, sure, ambassador, you know, Professor Suzuki, Aristo, come, the table is free, knowing full well that you don't have the capability to get there. You don't have the capability to get to the table to utilize it. And so on the one hand, I say space is free for everybody, and that's a wonderful principle, and we must never derogate from that. On the other hand, and this is what the question really recognizes, we have a huge capability divide. We have now maybe 60 or 70 countries in the world having some national space capability, albeit at very different levels. You know, the United States' capability is very different from Australia's capability, which is very different from Ghana's capability, right? But 60 or 70 countries have some capability. There's a divide between them. But what does that mean? That means 130 countries have no national capability at this stage and are entirely dependent upon cooperation and others. And so the point about equitable access is not necessarily equitable access to go to space, because some countries will just not be in a position to get to that, to the nasi goreng anytime soon. But the equitable access will be in the notion of how cooperation will allow others to bring them along. And that's where diplomacy, that's where regional diplomacy, the things that Professor Suzuki, the things that the ambassador were talking about, and the things that UNITA raised in her presentation are important. So yes, equitable access, but not to say, let's stop the freedom of going to space. Because once we do that, who decides? You know, who decides who can go and who cannot go, what you can do and what you can't do? Ultimately, we'll have to have broader decision on a global basis for some of those difficult questions. But in the meantime, it's about diplomacy to bring everybody along, recognizing that as we have a digital divide on the internet, we will always have a space divide. But because space involves everybody and it's in everybody's interests, we need to do our best to bring people along. I hope that answers the question, although it's probably not the answer that the person asking the question wanted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Stephen, for wonderfully explained in a very clear way on that nasi goreng bowls parts. So because of the time limits, we only have one more time for one more questions. And to the speaker, please answer these questions very briefly. This is for Ms. Melania from the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, to both of the speakers. After several decades of the UN COPUOS failed to agree on a legal instrument what do you think about the soft, non-legal binding instruments such as the LTS guidelines? Do you think that we need a legally binding international instruments that is up to date to today activities, including the commercializations? I hope that the question's clear. So please try to answer it briefly. We go to Professor Suzuki first, and then Professor Freeland.
Right. Of course, this is the Professor Freeman's domain, so I'll just make it quick. But from the political point of view, legally binding instrument is harder to make and not extremely efficient to cooperate, because if you want to make a legally binding instrument, then it will make it very blur and very because everyone wants to accept it, and if it's not accepted, it won't work, and it's not worth it. So if you try to achieve the legally binding agreement in the situation where everyone's interests are so divided, it's not the aim that I don't think this is an ideal aim to achieve. So what I suggest is to set up the a non-legally binding instrument such as LTS guidelines, or what I am currently involved in the process of the RPO, the rendezvous and proxy operations rulemaking, is to have the national legislations which have a high standard, and make sure that what I'm doing in Japan is to have a national regulations to regulate the Japanese private company called Astroscale and Scapa JSAT, and make sure that these companies are obliged to work with a national legislation and follow the national rules to set up the precedent of the higher standards, so that everyone can use it as the reference point as their activities, because it is very difficult to set the legally binding framework, and it is also very difficult to set up the international norms or international rules, non-binding, but something like LTS guidelines. It is still very difficult. So what I am trying to do is to set up the precedents and do it by the countries with the higher aim and the higher moralities to secure the safe and stable orbital environment. And this is where I think the RPO case is very interesting, because there is no precedents, no such private or public activities other than the docking of the International Space Station, so that the proximity and the rendezvous and the proximity operation is a sort of a blue ocean to challenge this idea of the unilateral norm setting by setting up the higher standards. But this is something new, and I think if you want to make the agreement, I think at least it has to be the non-binding, norm-based rules, and make sure that everyone could accept, but to set up the common understanding of this is how it works. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Freeland?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm conscious of the time. And this is a question where we could write a PhD on, of course. And Aristo, you and I are international lawyers. As international lawyers, we would say, of course, everything should be a treaty, right? Because we love treaties as international lawyers. But as a diplomat and a realist and a practical, that's not going to happen for a whole range of geopolitical reasons, at least in the short term. But here's the rub. People say you have to have a treaty because soft law doesn't work. Well, reality has shown us that just because you have a binding instrument doesn't mean everybody will comply. And just because you have, on the other hand, a non-binding instrument doesn't mean that people will do something different. You know, so it's not, of course, there are sanctions in international law. We understand that with binding instruments. We understand that. But the reality is how the process at getting at the endpoint, whatever the endpoint is. And that's my role, for example, in chairing the working group now. This is a really difficult issue, resources. You've seen all of the different perspectives, right? They're, you know, very, very different. And my role, together with my co-chair, is to bring everybody together in consensus. And that's going to be very difficult, right? But that process of bringing people together, whatever in the end your end product is, by way of an instrument, whether it's hard or, again, I hate the expression, but hard or soft law, if it's an understanding, if you've brought everybody along, if there's buy-in from everybody, then you have a much greater chance of understandings being complied with. Remember, with treaties, states have the opportunity not to be involved at all. And we've seen that with the Moon Agreement, for example. With a less binding document, I'm not saying it's better, but I'm saying the reality is, and in the end, it's interesting, we are negotiating the mandate of my working group, and part of what we have to do is tell people what we think the outcomes will be of our 5-year working group. And, you know, the states are talking about, you know, should we say possible binding instruments? And the United States, quite upfront, said, we cannot live with the word binding in this working group because our industry will not accept that. And therefore, we have to leave it and see how it all works out. And the reality is clearly you need the United States, but you need everybody in. And so if it means you have a non-binding instrument or framework or understanding or guidelines, if you've had buy-in from everybody, you're going to get much greater compliance. And guess what? They will be implemented in the national frameworks, as we're seeing with the debris mitigation guidelines and the long-term sustainability. And secondly, over time, because you've had buy-in, because you've had compliance, it might actually develop, it doesn't have to, but it might actually develop into something binding down the track anyway. So I think one has to keep an open mind and not have this notion that treaties, even though as international lawyers, we love them, right? But as that treaties are going to solve everything, they're not. And as Professor Suzuki quite rightly says, in these geopolitical times, we're just not going to get a binding arrangement agreed anytime soon. So let's have a process where we bring everybody together so we're all moving in the same path, we've got an understanding, and then things may build from there. So I hope that answers the question. And again, I thank you again for inviting me, and I can speak on Professor Suzuki's behalf, inviting us both to speak. It's been a wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Freeland, for your very clear explanations. I know that I'm aware that you have a time concern because you have a meeting right after this, but perhaps do you have time for one more short questions? Or okay. So
can I make just a quick comment? I sent a chat to the link to what I mentioned about the Japanese unilateral activities on the space traffic management and that rendezvous proximity operation. So please refer to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Suzuki. So one final question, I promised. Here is from my colleague at UI. Quite interesting questions for both Professor Freeland and Professor Suzuki. With more countries joining the US Artemis Accord, should Indonesia consider joining or creating an entirely separate legal regimes for its space diplomacy on resources? Maybe we'll start with Professor Suzuki and then Professor Freeland, and then we'll close the session.
Right, quickly. Artemis Accord is the sort of a mini-lateral attempt to set up the resource issue. So I leave Professor Freeland to discuss it. I think this mini-lateral framework may be useful, but in this case, I think it's not a sort of a legal requirement for Indonesia to join. I think this is more a political declaration of supporting the idea of the Artemis project, Artemis plan. So Japan is part of the Artemis Accord, but it is, and of course Japan is part of participating in the Artemis project. So I think this is sort of making sense, but unless you have the interest in the manned space activities or resource extracting activities, I think it's not necessarily now that you need to join. But if you have certain intention and using the Artemis program as the channel for the Indonesian capability building for the planet resource extraction or any type of manned space program, then you might be able to join the Artemis Accord. But at this moment, I don't think it's a huge necessity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Suzuki. Professor Freeland?
Oh, thank you. Also, clearly you'll understand that I'll be a bit circumspect. I certainly don't want, given my role at the UN, I don't want to be seen to be criticizing or praising any initiative. But clearly we all understand the Artemis Accords. My country, Australia, and I was not involved for obvious reasons, is also a signatory to the Artemis Accords, like Japan, and also a party to the Moon Agreement, which deals with resources. And so we have this unique situation, which you know, the government is comfortable with, which is fine. So my perspective is this: the Artemis Accords are, as Professor Suzuki said, minilateralism. The issue of resources requires a multilateral process. The Artemis Accords have some interesting ideas. I won't comment on the specifics, and will be an incredibly important input into the multilateral process through our working group. Incredibly important. But it will be one of several inputs from all countries, including Indonesia, if it has a view. And so whatever in the end might be the outcome of our working group, and I cannot prejudge anything, but what I can say is it won't look exactly like Artemis. It will be the result of 99 countries and all stakeholders having their views, looking at a whole range of other initiatives as well as Artemis. So should Indonesia join? Well, of course, that's a decision for Indonesia. And Australia has taken that decision. Japan has taken that decision. They have close links with the United States. They have great interest, perhaps, in using parts of their technology to engage in both the Artemis project and the resources side of it. I can't comment as to Indonesia's level of interest, but it's not a reason to join Artemis to say this is the main game. If you consider that in the end, it will be a multilateral process. It will be an important piece of the puzzle, but the main game will involve all of the countries because other countries outside of the Artemis signatories have the capacity, interest, and capability to do some of these activities. And if they're not part of the Artemis Accords and there is no other framework in place, then we have the scope for misunderstandings. And so therefore, I think I'll leave it at that. Please understand I have to be neutral on this point, but of course, in the end, it will be a decision for Indonesia to make. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Freeland, and thank you very much. It's been a very, very interesting discussions, and we have a lot of more and more questions that we really want to ask, but because of the time limit, I think it's so unfortunate that we cannot really ask all of the questions from all the participants. So I think we're already in our closing sessions. So before we end this webinars, I want to invite Dr. Heru for a brief closing remarks. Dr. Heru, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mas Tio, and thank you, professors, for all the lectures that we had today. My remark may be that from what Professor Suzuki mentioned, that the camera of Takahashi Sensei, his colleague, will be on board of Indonesian satellite, Lapan satellite. It should be in orbit last year, but because of the pandemic, we cannot finish the satellite last year, and we could finish it this year, but then our colleague that we launched it, the India Space Agency, said they are the one that have a problem finishing the launch vehicle. So they will be on board next year, and the Japanese infrared camera in Indonesian satellite will be the sign of the real cooperation between the country. My remark for Professor Freeland, it's really amazing to see that the New Zealand could finish this legal framework in 1 year for the launch, and we will have to contact you, come back to you on that, asking what's the secret, because in our case, making this legal product is usually quite complicated and time consuming. And for Mr. Andre Sirega, our consulate general in the US, that what he mentioned about last week was there is a National Space Day that we commemorate in Indonesia, and our chairman is making some presentation on the progress that we do. So again, as I mentioned, there will be some changes in our organization of space agencies. We try to create a greater impact to the nation from what initially known as the research agency, as a research services that we provide. For example, this remote sensing images for the disaster management or forest fire, which is annually happening in Indonesia. We will try to switch it with the new organization into infrastructure service for the nation, just like our telecommunication satellite in the 70s, and it will. And in the 80s, we know it it is privatized, and this privatization it's create expansion of the activities. That is what we are trying to foresee in the future. So if we are joining a space race, as Professor Freeland mentioned, or Professor Suzuki mentioned as well, that it's going to be a different kind of race, different kind of game. It will be more to the commercial, like when we establish a spaceport, which has a lot of diplomatic issues, and among others. And yes, that the world has changed from when I went to US and studied aerospace engineering at the end of the Cold War. Now, the mindset of the people back then was this world security from a weapon of mass destruction. And now it has been changed into this commercial, and it is really amazed to hear that the Australian space law has integrated these new space ideas into it. So we'll have to learn again from you about this. So again, I cannot thank you enough for joining us. And we have about 130 participants in today's webinar. And for us, for the very small community in Indonesia, for the soft science of space activities, it's already a lot. It's a big event for us. So again, thank you very much, Professor Suzuki and Professor Freeland, and also Pak Andre for this is almost midnight in Houston, and for staying up for our event. And Mbak Yunita and Mas Deden, Mas Tio, thank you very much for all the making this happen for us. Silakan, Mas Tio.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Heri, for your remarkable closing remarks. So once again, I would like to thank you, Professor Freeland and Professor Suzuki-san, from the very insightful and enlightening discussions. So everyone, please join me to give a big round of applause for Professor Freeland and Professor Suzuki. I believe if this is an offline sessions, there will be a huge lot of applause for both of you. So thank you very much. So I would like also to remind all of you that we still have our next webinars tomorrow. 7:30 p.m. Jakarta times on the same issues. We will have Professor Daniel Wood from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to give us from the US perspective, and Mrs. Rajagopalan from the Observer Research Foundation's India will give the Indian perspective. So with that, thank you very much once again, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Right.